This conference will now be recorded.
Well, good morning, everyone. Commissioner Stacy White from Hillsborough County, the vice chair of the board. I'll be chairing the meeting this morning. Please forgive me for my tardiness. It was an overturned semi on 275. It's an absolute mess out there. But with that being said, I will call this meeting to order. And we'll ask Mr. Sherwood if we have any changes to the agenda. Yes, forgive me. Yes, let's do a roll call first.
Commissioner Justice, Commissioner White,
Here.
Commissioner Van Ostenberg,
Here.
Richard Jenkins for Commissioner Fitzpatrick, Councilmember Foster, Councilmember Dingfelder,
Here.
Councilmember Beckman, Tom McGill,
Here.
Kelly Boatright,
Here.
Dr. Hogarth.
Here.
We have a quorum. Vice Chair.
Fantastic. And that will take us to changes to the agenda.
Welcome back, Hogarth.
Welcome aboard.
Nice to be here.
Yes, sir.
So there's no formal change to the agenda, but I do want to bring to the board's attention there were some updates to the agenda on the agenda packet earlier this month. Agenda item 4 for the next different column of the budget was adjusted to the total revenue based on work. Well, update on the agenda item for the program that totals 100. Again, minor updates that are reflected in digital version of the package.
Very good. Well, given that we do have some changes to the backup materials and some additional information, I will entertain a motion to accept the changes to the agenda.
So moved.
Okay, have a motion. Is there a second? Okay, I have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? They show that the changes to the agenda have passed. And that will take us to approval of the minutes from the August 20th, 2021 Policy Board meeting. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
We have a motion. Is there a second? Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, show the motion passes unanimously. Mr. Sherwood, do we have any citizen comments?
There are no comments on the virtual platform.
Okay, let the record reflect that we have no one wishing to make public comments to the board. So Mr. Sherwood, does that take us to item 4, the quarterly financial report? Okay, I'll turn that over to you.
Page 11 of your package is the formal quarterly report for the period at September 30th, 2021. Quarterly report also reflects our final budget, proposed budget for some notes in terms of both revenues and expenses to go over. You can see a slight increase in federal funding in the program as well as the SSD license play. Revenue went up in terms of SSD license play revenue, about $121,000 this year. The total, our total revenues were about $2.9 million, slightly below what we anticipated during the year's budget. On the expenditure side, fairly in line with most of our line item expenditures, except at the bottom for other expenses. We went over by about $1,700 there, and that was So, trying primarily due to filing fees associated with the local. Did not anticipate that in your budget. That's why you see, slightly over. But it's all we're able to absorb that. So we had about 2.17 million for expenditures for last year. We had slightly lower than the budget. We brought the net income to the program at $85,732. Ending funding balance of $2.3. Happy to entertain any questions on fourth quarter financial report. The only other thing I mentioned was, I failed to mention was that there's another footnote in terms of in-kind revenue, usually types like that in the first year of our EPA grant. We're still waiting on documentation from the partners that in-kind revenue for the booking unit. With that, entertain questions on that one.
Ed, this is a reminder that the folks online can't hear you. We need to get real close to the mic.
Very good. Are there any questions of Mr. Sherwood about the quarterly financials? Okay, seeing none, I will entertain a motion to accept the quarterly financial report and adopt the final FY 2021 program-wide budget.
So moved.
I have a motion. Is there a second? I have a motion and a second. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, show that the motion passes unanimously. Mr. Sherwood, I guess that takes us to item 5.
Moving on to item 5, start each roll of the packet. What we typically try to do at this November meeting, bring the attention of the board on the priorities of both our state elected and federal elected facilities and regions. We try to put forward and allow education on the projects that we are working on as part of the entry program. So much of the priorities that I've listed here reflect past priorities that are shared by the board and the program in Florida. Those are project drives, support the education for the transport reduction, for stormwater, as well as wastewater infrastructure. Driving initiatives that will support overall state water quality improvement. Working on what we're talking about today, wages for causeway operation infrastructure improvement. And for this year, I just want to highlight a couple of these things that will be focused on and steps required. All of which is private and federal social marketing campaign that we're currently involved in. And I think this is another prime issue for needed support for aging infrastructure in the region and how we work together to fix those issues that have created overflow for some part of the town. So raising education in terms of our state and federal elected officials on that issue, and encouraging them to support protection, repair, and replacement programs. Also, just to mention, we've been in conversations with other specialty like organizations that have similar needs. Well, our annual renewal fee is about $50 for the that is lower than the majority of specialty like states. Annual renewal $5. So we've been working with other organizations that have that lower each city is there might be support what's the current fee? It's $15, and there's a DMV, and in total, it's about $17. That's what you're saying, because on top, yeah, that you bring more revenue, how long is it been 15 months? It's 7, and 19, back in, you have. So there are several organizations that have that lower fees, like I said, the majority of them do it. $25. Sort of be surprised with this incentive, just because it seems like if people are motivated to do it, they're going to do it. $15, $25.
Any other feedback for Ed on that? I think what he's asking of the board is to apply our blessing to increase that to $15, $25. That's my share.
Yeah, I think it makes all the sense in the world, Ed. You have my support.
I'm oftentimes averse to raising fees like that, but I take a common sense approach to it, and I always ask myself, well, fees that hang out there a long time without any sort of inflation increase. I think we all agree that, you know, the value of the dollar is not, we're going to talk. And I think I would just really hammer on that point that it's, you know, spend $15 for over 2 years without even any sort of inflation increase. So I think that, you know, speaking of what you're doing, I just think and then I sort of hijacked your paper copy of the agenda here before we vote on this item and move forward. I just
Yeah, well, there's several potential models way that or but again, I think that is for additional stormwater wastewater infrastructure and how we deal with that side. It's still being worked out, but I know your plan is trying to bring this to better figure out the tenant, but there are a little bit of what it costs. The only other thing to mention, the preview for the passage of the infrastructure bill that the National Infrastructure Correction meeting has been for funding, additional funding for the next 5 years. That required funding. The bill was signed into law earlier this week. And what that would mean is we have potential for about $950,000 dedicated to come into the program, in fiscal year 2023, the next 5 years. So that's in addition to appropriations that may come through the regular appropriations for the next 5 years. So we're anticipating a fairly significant jump in federal revenues coming into the program. Again, a lot of details to be worked out with the CPA to our program proper agreements. But it's likely that we'll have nearly 1.7 million in federal revenue great care of ingredients and process. Again, tailored for reducing fluid reduction projects, and other priorities that we have in the region. So my plan would be to develop some draft plans for our work plan for fiscal year 2023, and typically we bring that back to the board February next year, and then fully adopt that plan, I would say, May. Yeah, there's plenty of time to kind of look at details a little bit more understanding about what you live everything, but so good news in terms of additional funding.
Ed, is there any thoughts of various groups in the state getting together and looking at these pots of money and have a sort of coordinated approach? I know National Fisheries Service, NOAA's got a bunch of money. And talking to Steve Morowski last night, you know, money for mapping, money for this, money for that. And I think if we had a better coordinated program rather than fragmented program, maybe we'd do better. A bit of a controversy between Florida and the federal government, but I think at some point, if we could get the universities and research groups and other groups together and talk about programs and do it with some unified programs, it would be helpful. So I don't know how it take place. I think there's some opportunities, a lot of opportunities there. Looking at the amount of money, even though I have billions of dollars. So I'd like to see Florida really give you that much issues. So it would be a great avenue to do it, but I think we could find a coordinated approach. I think would help us somewhere. So,
Yeah. Good point. The details in terms of how much goes from federal to local government, it's still unclear. This is what we work together with already talked about. That's ways to increase the structure and benefit environment conversation.
John, I have a question. Sir. In regard to Senate 64, the city of Tampa is, I should say, relying, but definitely leaning on that bill as part of the city administration's impetus to stop discharging so much sewage effluent into the bay and injecting it back upstream. And I'm just wondering, and I'll ask my city people that as well, is how much nutrient load impact that's going to be in a positive way for the bay doing that. So that's just the city of Tampa, but I can't help but think, are there other entities around the bay that are going to be impacted by SB 64 in the same way that the city of Tampa's discharge is? And if so, has anybody quantified the positive impact of that in that regard to the bay? I mean, there's other impacts that I won't get into in terms of financial and that sort of thing, but in terms of the nutrient.
Again, my short answer is yes. There are other direct strategies they offer. Use the word that I can sort of use develop the loading number. Fixed salary from the five. Their responsibility to maintain the farm. So any of the removal of the discharge generally has an extra reduction benefit in terms of loading Again, we can quantify that based on the volume and the population of the. Oh, yeah, I don't know if you want to-
Yeah, Ed, so in the Southwest District, there are 27 facilities that have surface water discharges. And Senate Bill 64, the first phase, required that they submit a plan, or at least a statement saying they plan to address the discontinuing the surface discharges by November 1. Plan to plan. And if they submitted that plan, they have until 2032 to then implement it. For the whole state of Florida, we had almost 100% folks submit that plan. One did not, and it was Rice Creek in Hillsborough County for some odd reason, even though we as a department reached out several times to them to ask and remind them, hey, submit a plan. So with that said, everybody has about 10 years to figure out how they want to handle that. And most of these conversations are coming out of our Division of Water Resource Management in Tallahassee with some input, with the districts.
I guess at some point, somebody's going to model positive benefits and how big of an impact we hope this might be. Taking a guess on that yet, or is that still too early?
10 to 10, depending on how much discharge is that.
I'm sorry.
10 to 10, depending on the source.
Great. That's meaningful. New to your world. Excuse my language.
Yeah, the projects of that nature were identified in the current operating management plan. Moving towards current discharge today, what are the fully executed.
Now, I think of Rice Creek, I think of a small pond in the Alpine River and a nearby local home park of the same name. What are you referring to Rice Creek?
To be honest, that's what I'm thinking of as well. I mean, it was anybody that had a surface water discharge, regardless of the size.
So is it the Rice Creek community that you're looking for the plan? I might be able to help with that.
Let me find out, Commissioner. My permitting folks were more involved in that,
Okay.
and then I can reach back out to your office and let you
Okay,
know.
that'd be great. I'd be
Sure.
happy to help.
I appreciate it.
I just want to make sure we're talking about the same Rice Creek.
Gotcha.
Are there any other questions for Ed, comments?
Just wanted to mention one other thing that came up there that board meeting. There's some potential acquisition considerations on the table. I think Senator Boyd is looking at looking for acquisition of Rattlesnake. So whether or not that's
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, I brought it to Ed's attention. It's just to the, Rattlesnake is just to the north of my district. We're in the process of redistricting, so it'll probably be in my district in 2 weeks. But Senator Boyd, who's a good friend of mine, he grew up in that area. Rattlesnake is essentially, if you go to Manatee County on the Skyway, it's going to be on your right-hand side, and it's all of that untouched, pristine area right there. There is potential for development in that area. So that is a concern. And the property owner is open to, right now they're going through the appraisal process and they're open to selling it to the state. They would rather see it in state hands and sort of cash out and go on their way. So Senator Boyd as the governor's office is very open to it. It sounds like the leadership is open to it. We're guessing, I have a real estate background, and we're guessing that it's going to be, it's hard to find a comparable for an island in Tampa Bay, but we're guessing we're going to be in the $20 to $30 million range. Manatee County Board of County Commissioners has not officially voted on it, but it was discussed in our last meeting, and there were a lot of bobbing heads and nodding heads when it was discussed the possibility of the county having some skin in the game and contributing to it as well. So he does have support, it seems, from our county commission on it. And it wouldn't just be purchased and left there. That we're actually sort of in a tug of war over whether it would become a state park or whether the county would have control of it. And of course, I think we would look to probably Robinson Preserve as an example of the approach that we would take with it. So, access with trails, possibly camping. It's not accessible via car, so it would be sort of a hybrid between Egmont Key and Robinson Preserve. So sort of think of it that way. But I don't think it's a very controversial thing. I think the only disagreements anybody has is, the money, and then, the answer is always money, right? So, money, and then who gets to run it, because I think it's gonna be a great asset, and it's gonna be we'll have an arm wrestling contest to decide who gets to actually manage it. But yeah, we're waiting for an appraisal to come back. I'm telling you that best I can determine, it's going to be between 20 and 30 million. So the C275 there, it's going to be it's the island just to the south of 275. Lots of coastline on the open bay on the left, and then Terracea Bay on the right-hand side. There's coastline there as well. And then you have lots of smaller inlets that run through there in McGill Bay. It's loaded with mangroves. I don't think it has as many rattlesnakes as people say. I think the property owner basically named it that to keep people off of his island security measure. But there is a considerable amount of wildlife. When I was a kid, you used to go out there and camp, and it's where you learn how to drink beer before you're supposed to drink beer, And so there are hogs out there. I mean, there are snakes out there. There's raccoons. There's all that. So there's a pretty substantial amount of wildlife out there on the island. So anyway, it's not a controversial thing. So I asked Ed if we could bring it to this board to essentially task Ed with penning a letter to, Senator Boyd is carrying it on the Senate side, and Robinson is carrying it on the House side, and send it off to the leadership and the governor as well, just a supportive letter. So I'd like to make a motion that we direct Ed Sherwood to pen a letter of support for the purchase of Rattlesnake Key.
I just wanted to ask you.
Well, currently it's private property. Yeah, currently it's private property. So obviously access would be increased from what it is now. There are a lot of exotics out there. There's a lot of Australian pines. There's Brazilian peppers, that sort of thing. And it hasn't been determined which agency is going to go in and remove exotics and then manage it. But either way, I think the senator and I both have visions of it being accessible to the public. Trails, pavilions, an outhouse is probably the best you'll do. Yeah, and I would love to see a camping area. He didn't shake his head when I brought that up. Because Egmont, you're not allowed to camp out there anymore. We seem to like discourage it, and I'm like, we should encourage it. We should tell you to go out there and camp. So at any rate, it's full of possibilities.
Boyd's a friend of mine as well, and groups that they can get things done, and get things moving without asking. So it's going to be a chance. It's traction. And I'll just leave it up to you as to whether or not the letter's signed by you or you prepare it in such a way that it's signed by Chairman Justice. But certainly in the letter that I'd like to state that the board has taken action.
And maybe to Commissioner Jenkins' point, maybe we should include something in there about the opportunity for public access.
We set that as a friendly amendment. I see you had not, so. I agree with you. When people are able to spend time on public property like that and create family memories and whatnot, I think it just only strengthens people's understanding and feelings about conservation and how important it is to protect these natural areas. And I'm all about safety. I do public access. Any further discussion? We have had some discussion on this one. Any further discussion on this one? All right, seeing none, all in favor, this is for the letter of support for the acquisition of Rattlesnake. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Show that motion carries unanimously.
Mr. Chairman, speaking of Rattlesnake, I have to point out a little trivia. So if you go to Dandy Ridge, when you hit the Tampa side, that entire community was called Rattlesnake. And the post office was actually named Rattlesnake. Rattlesnake Farm. Apparently, there were a lot of big rattlesnakes.
Yeah, a lot of those names stem from a much different era for this one, that's for sure. And do you have anything further on the Estuary Alliance and Tampa Bay Estuary Program legislative priorities?
No, I think we just look for a motion to stop.
Before I ask for that motion, are there any further questions or comments? Okay, so I will entertain a motion to approve the FY 2022 for the Estuary Alliance and Estuary Program legislative priorities. We have a motion, second. Do we have a second? And a second. Any discussion of the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? So that passes unanimously. Yeah, I guess that takes us to item 6, legal services contract.
Yeah, thank you. So, as many know, Dr. Thomas provided legal services. And they actually approval as of May 29th, 48. That agreement is set to expire at the end of this year. So what we are seeking for approval for an additional amendment, setting it for an additional 2 years. So January 1st, 2022, December 31st, 2023. That would be the only change in terms of the terms and conditions of the contract. Expiration date of the agreement, graciously accepted the same hourly rate that you go with. Having that for the program. That amended.
You get it. Any questions? Questions, comments? All right, do I have a motion then to approve this contract for legal services? The amendment to the contract.
So moved.
Do I have a motion to a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion of the motion?
Any commentary from the wise legal sage?
Not a bit, I'm staying quiet.
I think Don's happy. No discussion. It is done. All right, seeing no further discussion to the motion for approval, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, let the record reflect that passes.
Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. Thank you, Don. Certainly glad to have you on board.
Thank you.
Yes. And I guess item 7, restoration coordination and technical services.
This item starts on page 14 of your packet. As I mentioned at the last board meeting, we are considering several projects for stormwater and habitat restoration along the big watershed. And we don't currently have any technical support or ability to develop design or permits for this technical project. So as I discussed at the last board meeting,
hardware contracts to piggyback off of. Based on the feedback I got at the last board meeting, that's what was the idea of piggybacking off existing hardware contracts. So in the last board meeting, and this one, we contacted several partners, received existing contracts for purposes that we felt might be support the additional stormwater and recreation projects. Our comparisons of the contract centered on cost for specific job categories and hourly rates specified in each of the various contracts on partner. And our focus was on the lowest overall cost based on the job categories we would need in terms of developing recreation design concepts and helping out with construction. That was the first sort of cutoff. The second cutoff was just performance on similar projects of the nature that we were contemplating this new contract. So based on that assessment, what we were proposing is to piggyback off an existing contract that Allen County has with environmental solutions. They just entered into that contract with them in August of this year. It runs for 5 years. That is important in terms of piggybacking, so our feedback is not relating that initial contract and our project scope. So what we're proposing is piggyback off that existing contract for cost of $800,000 with authorization by the board if we receive additional funding that we can then scope it under that contract. I'd be happy to entertain any questions. Again, this is a technical support research that we will certainly have on staff or external contractor support. And we're looking forward to utilizing services, targeting projects, and that they look to get in preliminary conversations with Rocky Point Golf Course as well as property adjacent to Rocky Point Golf Course as a potential site for this is basically our attempt to catalyze action for these important projects that will hopefully have one body that essentially will campaign. So again, I'll stop there, but these are basic services to support the central design for this purpose.
Do you have any questions or comments for Ed? All right, seeing none, I will ask for a motion to approve the recommended board motion for item 7.
So moved.
We have a motion, is there a second? We have a motion and a second, any discussion of the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Let the record reflect that that passes unanimously. And I guess that takes us to item 8.
Some complementary to the last action. So I mentioned at the last board meeting that entry program was a recipient of $100,000 from settlement agreement between the city of Largo and Good Water Heat. That $100,000 was being directed toward a project, water quality or habitat within the big water system itself. What we were constantly at the time was adding on and advancing existing projects and received by Pinellas County government. They are actively moving Swayberry Repair adjacent to Featherside along the Channel 5 Oakland Creek. It does some additional dredging work to facilitate that removal. And with this additional funding that we hope to support this project, we're going to add on the habitat restoration benefits associated with that removal. This is one of the high priority phase in the past. Trying to restore tidal creek connectivity and function of a very altered system. So this has been a priority of a long time for the program for past season. This full implementation with things. So you're asking for approval to authorize me to pursue a contract with Pinellas County to enhance that plant habitat restoration at the Roosevelt Creek, if we will comply with it. We're not, and then authorize me to amend scope of budget up to the 25,000 for that contract. If additional funds
Any questions or comments on this item? Councilman Ego?
Mr. Chair, at the bottom of the memo, you make reference to our goal, our 2020 goal for habitat restoration and stream restoration, 1,000 acres, 4 miles respectively. So I realize 2020 was not long ago, but you know, what is the acreage and or stream distance that this was from? Everybody?
Yeah, it's a little less than an acre in terms of total habitat restoration. I think it's slightly over a mile for the length of the stormwater run, kind of working on going down to the top here, maybe 4,800 feet, something like that.
So it does bite up a little bit, especially in terms of the stream.
Yeah, this channelized system runs from basically the main road bridge where we're located up to that almost road on Elk County, right? So that area would be more regional entities like I have. And I don't think
So just in the big picture sense of the goal of 1,000 acres, is that just our goal of what we can do, or do we look at what all agencies are doing?
throughout the water. And that's our 2030 target. Correct?
Right.
Yeah, lost here. That's progress.
As a program, when we say we mean all of the partners, the parties to the, yeah.
So will we get an annual update on the achieving that goal?
Yep, we're actually going to be presenting some of that information at our upcoming December.
I'll move the,
Okay, we have a motion to approve the recommended board motion for item 8, approval of habitat restoration contract with Pinellas County. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion of the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, that motion passes unanimously. At item 9, Bay Mini Grant projects.
Yeah, turn it over to Sheila Blair.
Where you will find attachments for spreadsheets with all of the grant application, the budget, a summary of each of the grants recommended for funding, and a summary of the grants not recommended for funding. Bay Mini grant press release is sent out to our email list, our entire grant awardees, and other interested parties around the watershed. We held a grant writing webinar, which was recorded and released in August to help those who are interested in improving their grant application. September 24th was the deadline for application submission, and we received a total of 25 applications. Of those, 14 applications were for first-time voters. We had 5 CAC members volunteer to serve on the Bay Mini Grant Review Committee. Each grant was randomly assigned to 3 judges for review. The judges scored the application based on the strength of the proposal, the ability of the applicant to complete the project, cost justification, and improvement to candidate. Priority this year was given to cost-effective projects that help to expand the use of clean infrastructure in Tampa Bay. The judges have about 2 weeks to review each of the projects. And then they would discuss during the virtual review meeting on October 12th. And the executive director finalized the recommended project for board consideration, taking into account the restoration and education priorities identified in the application and the findings from the study. So in total, 21 projects are recommended for full or partial funding, for a total funding request of $93,572.28. At this time, I will entertain.
Are there any questions or comments for Ed or Sheila on this item?
Just to Mr. Khan, my disclosure that I am a member of past president of the People Rotary Club, which is a recipient, and but I have no personal gain and no reason to recuse myself from my opinion.
I agree.
But as a member and a past president, I'm very proud that we're participating in this. As a matter of fact, we got to jump on this because we were mangrove planting a couple of weeks ago. This is great. We had 25 people turning out right there by the Boulevard Bridge, over the river right next to the Army Shores. Put in a couple of mangroves. That's just stuff.
Very good. And I'll just say for the record, as we're reporting minutes from the meeting, to let the record reflect that legal counsel has advised that there is no legal requirement for counsel to do so in the state.
That is correct.
Very good. Any further comments or questions for staff? All right, seeing none, I will entertain a motion to approve funding of main mini grants based on findings of the advisory committee and executive director's recommendations.
So moved.
Motion
Second.
and a second. Any discussion of the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Let the record reflect that that passes unanimously. Next item.
This item refers to Tampa Bay Environmental.
Yeah, so late this summer, the town of Redington Beach notified us that they requested to cancel the contract for their water quality improvement project for Boca Ciega Bay. This came as a result of a change in their elected leadership, as well as a change in community sentiment after Tropical Storm Eta came through and resulted in a lot of flooding in those beach communities. So we have mutually agreed to terminate that agreement with the town of Redington Beach, and that leaves us with additional funds that are available to apply to another Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund project from the 2020 applicant pool. One of the things that was important and unique about the town of Redington Beach project was that it was partially funded from special environmental project funds from another settlement associated with the sewage spills in 2015 and 2016 from the city of Gulfport. And so those funds must be applied to water quality benefits in the Boca Ciega Bay segment. Fortunately, there was another project in that 2020 Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund year that met the same kind of criteria that the Redington Beach project did. And so that's the project that's before you today. This is the Treasure Bay Living Shoreline and Water Quality Improvement Project. This project was funded during the 2020 Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund approval process by you all. And what we've done is we've talked with the city of Treasure Island to see if they would be amenable to accepting those excess funds that are now available to enhance their existing project to provide additional stormwater polishing and water quality benefits for the Treasure Bay Golf Course. The city is amenable and has provided a draft scope of work. This project is one that's also been looked upon favorably by the Florida legislature and the Florida Department of Environmental Protection for the Resilient Florida funds. And so This is before you today because the amount of funds that we have available is $28,875. That is in excess of the executive director's authority to amend the existing agreement of up to $25,000. And so that's the action that we're requesting, that you authorize the executive director to amend our existing agreement with the city of Treasure Island for the Treasure Bay Living Shoreline and Water Quality Improvement Project to provide the additional $28,875 for those supplemental water quality improvements. I'm happy to answer any questions y'all might have.
Seeing none, I will entertain a motion to approve the recommended board motion for item 10, the Treasure Bay Living Shoreline Water Quality Improvement Contract. Motion, second.
Second.
Have a motion and a second. Any discussion of the motion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Let the record reflect that that item passes unanimously.
Executive Director, staff report, that a couple of things mentioned briefly to the board. With the retirement of Ron Hoffler earlier this month, there's a need to designate an interim executive director for a plan to plan out on my part. So just want to bring this board attention that there's a memo that I'll send out later today, designated my work as assistant director and interim executive director. Another positive note that happened over the past quarter, we received 2 additional grants, external grants, that bring some additional staff resources work into the program. First project related to actual grant NOAA that year just kicked off this past week with about 80 participants on an online webinar focused on improving the old tank bay water and refining mentioned that people old tank bay water and mainly focusing on restoration activities as well as hydrologic tidal circulation and improvement projects. So that grant is 1 year in scope in terms of developing a research plan that will further identify needed resources to further some out those methods. Second grant is one that I have been working on with the University of South Florida as well as other researchers in Iowa and the good looking at benefits of water quality and coastal improvements and how that relates to your economic benefits. Called blue green economy concept in terms of identifying the economic benefits of a couple of exciting projects that will further implement the activities of the CCFP and help us offset some of our staffing costs. The last thing I want to mention under the executive director resources is something that we've been contemplating internally. At this point, our banking relationship has been pretty consistent with Tuesday, originally Central Bank. We've had no issues with that banking relationship. We do receive some interest income from the company hold to Tuesday, but there's a concept I'd like the board to consider in terms of switching our banking relationship toward a bank that might align better with the environmental tenets that we've identified in the comprehensive management plan. But the contingencies for banking, for banks that we choose to do business with, they have to be qualified public depository in the state. So that includes a lot of banks that have additional environmental or certified B corporation status that identifies additional goals that they must have in terms of total environmental emissions. But over the past year, New Bank and Estuary has opened up their business for the first time. We've had conversations with them in terms of them seeking to be as with the state, as well as just learning more information about what their overall goals of committee philosophy are. But they're moving toward a net zero carbon goal for their next institutions. They're moving to clean energy, there will be for projects for the state. We felt that that bank has a lot of things that align with our goals. The other things to consider was some account comparisons that they provided based on our offerings that we have here right now. In comparison, they were earning interest rate around about $500 a month. And our offering typically provide about $6,000 in interest for the account that we hold. So there's a net there. Again, I'm bringing this to the board's attention to get a feel for your supplemental switching or making relationship. If there is a general positive feedback to this meeting, my plan would be to bring it back in February meeting for formal approval to change or make a relationship. At that point, we'll work with our accountant, provider to help support that. So I'll stop there. There's additional information in terms of the account comparison within the executive director report, as well as a presentation that they provided to their stakeholders. Their certified corporation set for them for the public sector related to and then there. With that, I'll stop. Board has any other questions?
Are there any questions or comments, Fred?
I don't really have any questions. I would just comment, as I stated to Ed when he briefed me on this, that I think this is the direction most banking is going anyway. There's less and less brick and mortar banks out there every day. So I don't have an issue with this. I think it's the trend.
How are they able to offer such a significant difference in interest rates?
To a couple of accounts that they're offering, money market accounts.
But that would increase the risk to equity.
If you do a regular checking account,
And the interest would go from what to what?
so in the budget we just have here, a little under $400 in interest this year. We carried up $2 million and around $2 million on the monthly average in the bank account. We felt all along that we probably earned a lot more interest based on trading for the market basis. And based on their assessments and basically the offer.
So it's about the same. Pretty close.
Significantly more. On a yearly basis.
Oh, we were over like $500 annual.
Yes.
Annual.
Yes.
Okay. And then that doesn't increase on risk exposure.
It's not especially once they qualify for the depository and they already have those guys.
So kind of the opposite side of that is it split our activity. Still have access to those funds.
Good question.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, they do not their taxes. But that's something I can just follow up with them.
Very good. Well, there's been a lot of good questions and comments. Are there any further questions or comments? And based upon that direction, I would like to ask a little bit with the question. You can include that in your February report.
Yeah, the big thing is that they need to be certified for data on the repository. They still have to do that, but I have not. That's what.
Okay, is there any further questions or comments?
Just wanted to mention, real quick, as one of the last update that you might have seen, we did, put those, Bay Area scientific information, what we call paper, this year, until next year. So planning to hold that, conference on February 28th, for, the upcoming, year. Again, what the agenda will be similar to what we were anticipating in October, but I just want to mention that. This is also a, let you know, based on the planning for that October meeting, we hold our 30th anniversary celebration. In tandem with that conference, we still held the 30th anniversary celebration at the same year, and get a little bit of highlights, and then some of you might not have been able to attend. We do have highlights of the 30th anniversary. We're originally supposed to be celebrating. Yeah, if you want to do your question.
Good morning, everybody. Like I mentioned, I'd like to give a super brief recap of that event. As many of you know, we've been celebrating our 30th anniversary this year. And so naturally, we wanted to hold an event to get everybody together, our friends, family, partners, and celebrate that. That is good. That's next slide. And then Ed had mentioned, we celebrated that on the 21st. Baywatch Discovery Center, right around sundown. We've seen some pictures, beautiful backdrop to the celebration. We had a good amount of people attend, including 98 RSVPs. As I mentioned, a lot of those were partners, family, friends, donors, and we also had some guest speakers who provided some inspiring words. Those included Commissioner Justice, Dr. Kate Hubbard from FWC, Jovan McNeil, the founder of Cloud9 Outdoors, and Dr. Ron Ford. And a big part of the event was, of course, the interlocal agreement signing ceremony. So throughout the event, we had that poster set up. We invited people to stop by in the midst of their mingling and attach their signature to it. And then at the end of the night, we all got together. So other than the event, we did have some things that we curated in tandem with the celebratory event. One of the main things that we have included in front of all of you today is the TVP 30th Anniversary Photo Journal, which includes 73 photos from 19 photographers, some of which are in the room today, and over 42 locations. This was a really fun project to work on. I had a woman by the name of Yvonne help me produce it. It's really grateful to her for putting this together with me. We also included some featured testimonials. So I hope all of you enjoy that. There are extras in that room before you leave if you'd like to take one more. Just feel free to use them. We also had a slightly smaller collaboration with a group called Pixel Planet, who created a sponsored seagrass science communication design for us. That went live on the day of our anniversary. So there's this nice other thing that we're celebrating in the digital space. It's really cool just to work with this group that came to us through Instagram, through those. We also tried to breathe a little bit more life to the Love Tampa Bay campaign by putting together, let me go to that next slide. One more. We tried to put a little bit more life to the Love Tampa Bay campaign, which of course is a hashtag campaign that promotes hashtag Love Tampa Bay. So to put that together, we created this sort of crowdsourced video where we asked people to send in video submissions of themselves enjoying Tampa Bay. And then we put it together in a short 1-minute video, just kind of showcase many different ways that someone could enjoy Tampa Bay. This was what we're calling the first episode of that. I'd like to do a little bit more in the future. Again, just to keep that hashtag campaign alive. Put some more. And lastly, I just have some photos for you, so we'll collage some photos of the event. As you can see, we had, like I said, sunset was setting, it was beautiful, it was a great time. A lot of people joined us, we're really fortunate to have all these people that come out. Really great time, and I really appreciate everyone who did make it, anyone who didn't make it, we'll see you. Well, I have for you. Happy to take any questions, otherwise. Good. Have one more staff update.
Yeah, it's good. I just want to make everybody aware that our 2021-2022 volunteer Give-A-Day for the Day events are now happening. So this weekend we have an event at Burrito. So we're going to be harvesting seeds from Burrito and then dispersing them in Robinson Preserve and expansion. On December 4th, we're doing a High Key Island, formerly Beer Can Island. And that will be a planting event. And then we have another one in January, and this will be another second phase of the Wakekeeping Give-A-Day for the Day, where we're removing debris that washed up from Tropical Storm Ada and encouraging artists and other organizations to reinstall and build different things with it. So we would love for all of you to come out to the event. Areas. It's our website, or reach out to you to the location that you want to have a Give-A-Day at, or you want to know when that's going
I have a question on that one. High Key, I believe, is privately owned. What are we going to be doing out there?
It is. We are working with them. We're going to be doing planting events. For a small section of the island.
What's the funding source?
We were going to be providing the funds for the plants, and then they were not going to mount to food for all of the volunteers, and that comes out of our work plan.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I don't know. This is a school island. It's in Hillsborough County, so I don't know how many folks have been following this issue, but they really brought in really some significant commercial on the TV.
Is this the place you wanted to turn it into like a party scene on the weekends or whatever and like charge people?
Yeah, and we've had to make some plans and changes to our comprehensive plan and everything. I guess there's probably precedent for doing this type of thing on private land, right? Partner with private landowners, right?
Per se, you don't put it like that. You have to look at whether or not it's conservation.
Yeah. I just, not trying to pick on Chad, I just don't want to set a bad precedent. So we may just want to leave the legal counsel, just take a look at that one and the fact that it is private. I was shocked a year or two back when I learned that the island was under private ownership. I mean, I didn't understand why it's not Fort Camp Bay, because it's a school island. But, somehow or other, the island is held under private ownership. They got a lot going on. So we may just want to.
I'll take a look at it.
I agree with you.
All right.
Offer that update. What we can make longer.
They are national top for food for all of the
And if we establish a public purpose, Don, I'm fine with
I understand. We- We need to have a very specific public purpose finding. Yes.
A lot of their coastal habitat restoration projects, we're going to give a little bit of update on Rock River expansion, for multiple different ways that this project is funded. Another great example of looking for any available resources.
Thank you very much. As Ed mentioned there, I'm with Manatee County Parks and Natural Resources. I've spent the last 10 years doing coastal projects up there, which I absolutely love. And I'm only with Manatee County until next Tuesday, and then I'm going back to the private sector after that. So, but honestly, these projects have shaped my career and my hearts. I grew up in this area, so this is just absolutely an honor to get to work on these. So I'll talk to you guys about the Robinson Preserve expansion, which a lot of people have heard about, like, wait, they're trying to get money for this or that or whatever else, because we've been rattling bushes all over the country. So if you don't know, Robinson Preserve, this is right at the southern end of the Tampa Bay, right at the interface with Sarasota Bay, south side of the Manatee River, right where those all come, so right where the dot is there. This is 150 acres that was in addition to the 482 acres of the original Robinson Preserve property. It was acquired in 2012. So this is just another map of it there, kind of in association with the other county coastal properties under our management through there. But the main thing is with this 150 acre expansion, this is a site of an a very extensive habitat restoration project. Change very impact local uplands, a mix of highly quality desirable habitats, and include a lot of passive use amenities like trails, and so we can just sit out there. We get people out there to enjoy and gain this appreciation for this kind of property. So the actual expansion is, you see the green things, and then there's a little colorful thing that looks like the cell diagram from a high school biology textbook. That's the different colors of the actual expansion area. So I have to be careful with this because I can talk about this project for 3 or 4 hours straight. There's so much cool stuff. So I'm going to try and go through a very kind of high elevation overview of this thing and just basically talk to you about how we went from 150 acres that looked like the aerial that you see in front of you, which was pretty much every invasive exotic species that you can list, put on top of abandoned agricultural land and spoiled it for about 15 years. And you can imagine that leaves a pretty nasty mess. And we turned it into this. So as Commissioner Van Ostenbridge said before, you can do anything with money. That was one of the biggest challenges to get there. And I'll kind of go over a little bit about how we do that. But one thing it takes is it takes good leadership to get these things done. We've had this from our current board and previous boards that allow the gentleman in the bottom right there, Charlie Hunsicker, our director, who has the vision from these things dating decades back. They give us long enough leash to go out there and let us shake the bushes and see what we can make happen. And then they'll show up at the volunteer events too. I love that part of it. We've had a lot of commissioners come out and put in some sweat equity on these things. To the point where it takes funding. The total amount of funding that we've had to spend on the Robinson Preserve expansion, which includes the acquisition of the property, the nature center, all of the roads, the pavilions, all the park amenities, as well as all of the habitat restoration work, is a little over $17.5 million. And you can see from the pie chart here, we've gotten over $6 million of that has come into the grants, and those went towards the habitat restoration work, which is what I worked on these properties. And you can see the various funding partnerships that go through with this. And let me tell you guys how much fun it is to try to keep this many funding partners and all of their required reports and everything else in line and happy and make sure their work gets done. The other thing that's really important on a project like this, which is it's just incredibly complex, is you have to have the right professionals come in and do this. So we've had a number of really good design engineering contractors, prime contractors, ecological contractors. This kind of speaks volumes to one of the values that we talk about sometimes with these projects is that they're an economic boom. They provide jobs. A lot of people have done a lot of work out on this property for years now. There's a lot of earthwork, moving work that goes into it, but then with those prime contractors, they're bringing in geotech and engineering and surveying. It's really fun to see all the different professions that get to have a hand in a project like this. Really important on this too is the amount of scientific understanding. I've heard over and over again in the meeting the value of the partnerships, the Estuary program. This one thing I'd like to personally thank a lot of the people with the Estuary program, that outside of the funding resources and literally the thousands of volunteer hours that we've had on these projects over the last 5 to 10 years, and we're gonna have more tomorrow, is anytime I've ever needed a hand, I can call Gary and Maya and Ed and anybody and say, hey, we're looking at this. What's the current literature on this? How do we get there? It's one of those values as partnership that sometimes doesn't get noticed as much, but is incredibly valued, because if we don't build these things on the best available science that's out there at that time, then they aren't as good as they can be. I'm really happy with the results we've had on this. So on to the project a little bit more. This is just a couple of aerials that show just a general site history. So you can see on the far left, this is a 1940s aerial. You can see even by 1940, this was in agricultural production. Really typical in Manatee County in these coastal areas to have that agriculture areas right out by the coast, because that was very well frost protected. So when you get those cold snaps in, you are less likely to lose your crops because you have all the buffering capacity of the waters nearby. The challenge with that is when you do start getting high tides, salt water and your tomatoes don't mix well, and that's one of the reasons they stopped doing these, is they started having issues with saltwater flooding onto some of these coastal areas. So you can see by the 1973 aerial, you don't have active crops here, and that kind of dark signature on the entire north side of that aerial map there, that is all 100% Australian pine trees. So once they get kind of abandoned, the soils have been disturbed, those are the kind of things that like to come in there. And then on the next aerial over, you'll see all the Australian pine trees are gone. Part of that's because of where this was heading. So you can see on these three exhibits here, the one on the far left was the approved and permitted development plan with the Pat Dye golf course. This was ready to go. The only reason that this didn't come into place is there's really two reasons in my personal view. Is one was the 2007-2008 economic downturn. That slowed everything down in that respect. And then the Robinson family at that time, I really think that it was a legacy issue, and with the original naming of the original portion of Robinson Preserve, that made this even a possible conversation, where we were able to go to them and say, hey, it's slow, you guys are going to be delayed for a while, is there any opportunity? So with those simple conversations start going, then we start moving towards the middle drawing, which is that kind of early start dreaming phase. Everybody sit down in the meeting and say, what could it turn into? How could we make this an asset to our community and bring ecological benefits and water quality benefits and fisheries and habitat and everything else? That's where I get really excited about it. So the one in the middle, this is the result after a meeting we had in about, I think, 2011, 2012, somewhere in there, where we had some stakeholders in the room. Everybody starts throwing ideas around the room. And I've got like pages of just like, as fast as I could write them down notes. And then I go home like, why that was all fresh in my mind. I just start scratching something out with highlighter markers to just start something moving there. And I mean, this went on like on to 3 in the morning. It was just a really exciting time to just kind of see what might happen with that. And you can see as that things started to come together, that's, it was, you know, surprised how close it held to the actual highlighter drawing from the meeting. But that was our design plans as we move forward. And that's the organ diagram that I like to call it. But it has all the different types of habitats, and I'll show you a larger view of that in a couple slides. So after that all came together with all the multiple funding partners and a lot of years of work, and this is what the aerial looks like of that aerial after final grading. And you can see there was a large focus on the estuarine component of this piece of property. You can see there's 2 acres of new oyster bar that were once a farm field right at the tidal interchange. A lot of marsh island. You can see a lot of edge habitat. But that was one of the things we really tried to do. I mentioned like trying to get the best available science out of these, is really focus on exactly what we were designing for to make these sorts of things as good as they can be. So when that all laid out, these were basically the target habitats. And if you guys are ever interested in knowing the exact elevations and acreages and all that, get a hold of me. I'll take you out there. We'll talk for hours, but I don't need to run through these things if you don't. You can find that out from me later. But one of the specific things that we wanted to design for was fisheries habitat, and specifically for juvenile snook, considering those an umbrella species, knowing that if we got the design right for this species, there would be benefits to numerous other species. So this one was going to be kind of the model that we chose to run the design towards. And this took a lot of input from a lot of very highly trained fishery scientists in the area. So for my part, I'm a restoration practitioner. I'm not dedicating my life specifically to the study of biology of any certain thing. My knowledge of snook comes from me trying to catch them. So I was in it for that. But I knew enough people in the field. I start putting some calls out and say, hey, look, we've got basically, in terms of restoration, an area that is so badly degraded, we're kind of looking at a blank slate. So if we're going to design this and point this and try to benefit juvenile snook in particular, we need to know everything there is to know about their life cycles, what their habitat requirements are. And I was absolutely amazed at the input I got back. It's a really important thing for me as a restoration practitioner, is to make sure there's as seamless, it just close this gap between practice and science. It happens too often where you have the brightest minds in the world on a particular subject aren't talking to the people that are actually going out there pointing out how we permit it and where we move the bulldozers. We worked really hard to make sure there was no gap between those two. So when I spoke to this room full of brilliant scientists and got another couple months of feedback back and forth to them, it's an amazing amount of information that these people threw back. So I run this back. I distilled this down into 6 general categories that we were going to aim for on the design. One of them was proximity and life cycle habits. That's this one. So basically, you need to have the site, if you're going to look to benefit juvenile snook, it has to be close enough to a spawning area so that they'll be able to get there in the first place. That was pretty easy because the mouth of the Manatee River is a well-documented snook spawning area, and that's one of them that I happen to also know from my research as a fisherman at the mouth of the Manatee River at certain times of the year, that the big female snook are out there. But you also need to have good fringe habitats of healthy existing habitat. We're very lucky in this part of Manatee County because we have a lot of mangrove forests, seagrass beds. It's one of the absolute most beautiful areas in the, not taking away from anybody else. I know you guys are from all over up here, but it's real pretty down there. Number 2 is you need to be able to feed specifically the juvenile snook in that first year of life, when they're not out there eating what I'm usually putting on a hook. They're eating very small invertebrates. And what I found out from these scientists is you're not going to go out and like put the little invertebrates out in the water. You need to provide the food that those things eat. So in that case, you have to maximize the amount of shoreline vegetation, shoreline complexity, and a lot of submerged woody vegetation, specifically so that it can grow that slimy stuff on it called periphyton, and that's what the food of the food eats. So we incorporated that into the design. You can see some of the pictures. Basically, as soon as we got done with earth moving, we came in right away with all kinds of volunteer groups. The two photos on the top left, one with the buckets, the same waterway there, that was like as soon as we got done moving the earth there, we came in with a Boy Scout group and planted all that in there, and that one's already got, you know, good establishment and that much more biomass to grow that periphyton to feed the invertebrates that will in turn feed the snook, which will in turn grow, and then I will catch it and they will feed me. So when we can keep. The second one there is we do a lot of things with volunteers. Sometimes like I had a part of this project where we had full-size Australian pine trees that were coming out, so we recycled those and we did that part with the track hoe and just use those old Australian pine trees, put them in the water to serve as the woody debris to help with that. I mentioned that there's about 2 acres of new oyster bar habitat that's associated with this project. It's really awesome. When you go out there and you look at all of that, the space between the shells, even before the oysters are mature in there, and you look close, just the amount of life, all the tiny crabs and shrimp and all these other strange things that other people know what to call, but I don't. They're little alive things. The amount of life that comes out of those is absolutely amazing. And then the photo on the bottom right just shows us once we've made that tidal connection, because of its proximity to existing good native habitats, there's an existing seed source for a lot of the mangroves. And these are all, like, these weren't planted. These are all as soon as we've created that tidal basin, we've got red mangrove starting up, black mangrove starting up. So it's ready to really start increasing that complexity even more over time. Another very important thing in terms of the needs for juvenile fish is that they need to have really calm water areas that are protected from heavy currents and wave and wind energy, because they don't want to just spend all their energy holding themselves in one place. If you have these kind of protected areas that are kind of skinny with wind protection, they don't have to fight just to hold still when it's wavy and currents are going all over the place. They can use that energy to grow and get out of there for the next year. So when you look at the design of this, you'll see there's a lot of these backwater areas where we started out real wide and then had a bottleneck and then came up and have high elevations on both sides of it to keep the wind energy down. Another important one is thermal refuge. We all know how hot it gets and the water can feel like you're in a bathtub if you're out in about August or September. So we didn't want to have the bottom elevation be consistent across all these. This had to create, you know, channels and holes so that at certain times of the year when it gets really hot, you have these deeper holes that have cooler water in the bottom of it. And the same thing in the winter when it gets really cold, you have some of these areas that are shallow that have organic material kind of up towards the surface, so that heats that area up. So you have basically enough diversity in the specific habitats so that they can, those juvenile fish can find a specific condition that fits their needs at that time. And you can see the bigger photograph here, you can see how we were able to achieve that. And we have the deeper holes there. The area kind of comes under the bridge. You can see where we have like one area where we have like a higher tidal velocity that changes that bottom color, makes some of these areas light. That was all, a lot of it was very intentional. The one thing I have to also point out here is the mangrove here. This is a special one. This mangrove grew up for several years on Gary's back porch. He grew this one out from seed and then gave me a call and said it's getting too big to repot. So we put this one out here, and this one's going to kind of be the model and teach all the other smaller mangroves how to do it. So this one is really hard. This is a physical protection from predators, being larger fish, like adult snook, jacks, ladyfish, the things that are going to want to come eat a small snook. Naturally, these things, there's a physical barrier in the form of those juvenile fish get these really far backwater areas that have mangrove roots and pipes and these sorts of things that keep those larger fish from going back there to eat it. So when we're starting from scratch, that's a hard thing to be able to get from day one, because the vegetation structure and complexity is very low from the start. So we were able to do that in a couple of different ways out here, and some of them are going to absolutely just need more time to mature until they're going to function that way. But on some of the water bodies where the civil engineer was fine with allowing me letting some of that water stack up because I didn't have offsite drainage come in. We achieved that by setting the invert elevation of the connection high enough so that it occasionally goes dry. So there's only a surface water connection between one of the larger water bodies and the rest of Tampa Bay on a storm tide, which is perfect for the biology of those small fish because they come in on a high surge like a storm tide in their larval phase. They get into these protected backwaters where they're not having to run from something that's going to eat them. There's a lot of vegetation to provide them food. They grow to that first year, and then they are programmed somehow to know when they get another storm tide, when they get to that size, they make their way back out. And apparently the blue crabs do the same thing, because I've already seen this once where we have a storm tide, all the blue crabs start heading out the pipes. It's really pretty cool to see. This is another one that's going to be a challenge for us. There's a need for eye protection in their development. They need to have quite a bit of shade so that their eyes develop correctly. Again, with a brand new site like this where you dug it out of an old farm field, it's kind of challenging to get that. So we're looking at actually providing some artificial shade in the form of some of the floating islands. And then Gary's mangrove is going to have to grow into the mangroves that are to the other side of the picture there. Once they get big, they'll have that overhang vegetation submerged where you can provide that. And this is a couple people in this room that did this, but this I am just incredibly grateful to this list of people that like got this out of the blue cold call from this guy who said, hey, we got a farm field, we're going to dig a hole in it. Come on down and talk to me about it. They either came down and provided a lot of input or pointed me in the direction of the right people, because I didn't know them at the time, and I'm really proud of what we were able to pull off in this location. Another consideration that we had for this property in the design that was a new one for us, it's definitely more common now, but more of an emerging concern as this was in that phase, was considerations of sea level rise in the design of a habitat restoration project. So for us, that was basically three main points. Is that one is how much do we want to have of hard infrastructure out here, knowing that this is a low-lying coastal area. One of the concerns that hits us right in the face with Robinson Preserve with the old portions are that we're already getting some days of like the sunny day flooding. When we get a high tide, we're having to close off some of our trails already because we're getting 3 or 4 inches of water on them. And then the other one was the upland planting considerations, where we're restoring the upland areas back to something like a pine flatwoods. It's going to take 40 to 50 years to reach maturity to the point where you have recognizably large pine trees that you could call like a pine flatwoods habitat. If we're setting those down so low that sea level rises are going to come up and take those out, we just skip that, gave that area up, and don't start planting pine trees until you get up to what we're considering like the 50-year projection on the sea level rise. So again, this is just for our part, we took this into consideration with our placement of amenities on the site, make sure that the hardened structures like the nature center, the pavilions, the parking lots, those were all in areas that were elevated. We were balanced on our cut and fill on this. So there's some pretty high areas compared to a lot of them on this site, because everywhere where you see we created water bodies, we didn't put that onto the road and truck it. We kept that all on site. And that was in addition to the original phase of Robinson in 2007 that had a lot of that material placed on this site in preparation to build the golf course community. So they were already laying that stuff down in order to get ready to build this. So we had a lot of ability to create elevation here. So this is just a lot of people have seen these models, but this is just this is the current level at mean high water. So this is Robinson Preserve with a 3-foot run. So we're talking probably 100 years out, depending on who you ask. But you can see a lot of the original portions of Robinson Preserve, we're going to have a hard time keeping a lot of that area open. So that's why with this one, on where we located our trails, we're setting that up for the long term. We're on a lot of those areas, we're at 25 feet above sea level rise. Makes for absolutely wonderful views, and a lot of people with expensive cameras are going to get really mad at me when the trees start to grow in and start to block those views. But that's part of the challenge we're going to deal with out there. So this is just some of the, if you've been to Robinson Preserve and been to the tower out there before, This photograph was taken right there in 2016, or this is just like your normal everyday scene out there. So this is what it looks like with about an extra 1.87 feet. This was taken during one of the tropical storms that came by out there. And this is a really good example that shows like the value of what kind of infrastructure you put where, because in this location, that bike rack is our infrastructure. A volunteer named Tom made that bike rack. I think it probably cost us about $18 in materials. And then when we get that big sea level rise, it just goes back down. We don't have to bring out the utilities to pump anything out or anything else. We're good to go. So, and this is just kind of when those photographs were taken during Tropical Storm Colin in 2016. This is just a quick graph that just shows the upland planting considerations. For us to figure that out, we looked at where we had stress on some of the original plantings at the Robinson Preserve, the original property, and we went out and surveyed those elevations and got the maximum, like the high and low elevations for different community types right there on the site so that we could use those as reference for where we sited and put the habitat types we're trying to create at the expansion. And the photograph here is just, this is, you can see all the mangrove nematophores coming up from the bottom and the prop roots kind of coming in from the side. Those are red and black mangroves. And you'll see this in a couple of places in Manatee County, but that's a lighter knot pine stump that's upright and rooted. So these things can be hundreds and hundreds of years old. They get that dense and they don't really rot. But this is just one of those reminders that, you know, things have already been changing. So if you're going to long-term plan for it, go ahead, because pine trees don't germinate in the mangroves. That pine tree germinated and grew there, and then the mangroves came up on it. So this is just a series of before and after photos. I took a lot of, there's a whole series of photos I took on the ground here before we started anything. And with the amount of change we put on the ground out here, they look kind of ridiculous at this point. They're not even the same, doesn't even look like the same area. So I'll show you a couple of those, and then some I took a little bit later down that are like more recognizable. So this is one where this was the aerial that you're seeing is 2014. You see the little purple camera here with the arrow. That's where I took that photo in the direction I was facing. So same thing. What was the dirt road that went by the power line? The power line's gone, the dirt road's gone. You're standing in about 3 feet of water now, facing the shoreline next to the oyster bay. So on the ground, this is what that looked like in 2013. And this is what it looks like now. So I picked this one to show because one of the power poles is still out there and will be for another 4 or 5 weeks. That's the same power pole. I can't take the photograph from the same elevation anymore. But it's been a pretty extensive change of landscape out there. And it's really, really awesome to see when you see like a school of small tarpon go through there and recognize like a lot of the frustrations you have with the wrong plants growing and everything else. And you see little tarpon come through and think, oh, this is why this is working. Because for a farm field that was full of exotics to be growing little tarpon on, that's really awesome. So the next couple ones were after our initial phase of earth moving before we started doing any kind of revegetation out there. This was the 2017 is the first one, and these are the same ones now. So this is 2017. After that, this is like kind of after this was taken a couple of weeks ago, but the actually it should be 10/28. So same situation here. You can see this is we just had built the pedestrian bridge out onto the island. We've put a lot of plants in the ground out there. We're setting this thing up to grow out nicely. So just some closing notes. Again, I mentioned some of the values the Estuary program had brought to this, especially from the scientific aspect and the volunteer aspect. I can't, it's thousands of hours of volunteer help that's come out on this project and on Perico Preserve. All of ours in Coast to Coast, they've been an absolutely awesome partner on that regard. But the other thing there is money that comes into this. I know currently on this project, the areas that are highlighted here, there's $271,000 that come through that was part of the Restore Act funding that came through, but came through the Estuary program on that funding. There was another $100,000 that we had to pick up a piece called the Winston Tract that was kind of a surprise, but we needed it to make the hydrology work. And it was a bit of a nightmare because it was in state ownership. We assumed the lease, and the state hadn't done anything with it. It was a mess. It didn't fit with what we were calling Robinson Preserve. We were able to go in for a grant with the Tampa Bay Environmental Restoration Fund, and that basically solved that problem.
Is that the piece that's along 64 along the
Yeah.
causeway? Okay.
Where all those giant Australian pine trees disappeared.
Yeah.
That was my fault. But the other really exciting thing about this, and I think probably has a lot to do with engaging the scientific community on this very early on and getting them to give input and get excited, is that outside of the counties doing at this point, are the various partners in this have gotten together $600,000 worth of funding to do research on this project, to look at the hydrodynamics, to really look closely at the fisheries benefit, because as practitioners, we're a lot of us are really guilty of this. Is we will go and we'll dig a hole and we'll make it saltwater, and then somebody will scoop a snook out of it, and we'll say, there it is. Everybody who catches a snook goes, me now. I've made this. Without actually knowing, like, for all we really know, we may have created an ecological sink where those juvenile snook are getting stuck in there, and we're just feeding great blue herons. So part of this study is going to look at to see if they're actually what kind of habitats specifically inside this system they use, and do they get out and add to the breeding population? To me, that's the ultimate question, because we always put this like it's an economic benefit. I grew up with guides out there. They're taking people out that come down here on vacation and provide support for habitat restoration because it supports the economy. There's a lot of assumption in that statement. This is going to help take some of that assumption out and see what it is. Is it, and to what extent it is, and if it's not, what can we do in a management sense to be able to make it that way and get the most out of the investment that goes into these properties. So that's all I got. So if you guys have any questions about it, just shoot them out.
Any questions for me, Councilman?
Thank you. That was a great presentation. Congratulations. Thank you. To, I guess, a lot of people for all of that. And two questions in regard to maintenance. What is the ongoing maintenance? What is the cost, to whoever's doing it, county or whatever, for ongoing maintenance? That's the first question. And the second question is perhaps not just to you, David, but to everybody, is this looks like an amazing project. Are there similar opportunities around the bay, to lands that haven't been claimed in such a sophisticated manner?
Well, I'll talk to the first point about the ongoing maintenance thing. That's something that I kind of failed to mention, but also definitely goes into the initial design of these areas. It's really important to me that if you're going to make the investment, and these are large dollars go in, that you don't do something that you'll have restored, you'll do a ribbon cutting, everybody does a high five, and then over 10 years, it just reverts back into garbage. When we have these estuarine habitats where you have salt marsh and open salt water, the stressors that provides for exotic vegetation reduces that. So all of our oyster habitat, our marsh habitat, our open water, we get the elevations right, they grow in. We don't have any more long-term management to do in those areas other than put signs up to tell the kayakers where to go. The challenge and the expensive part is in these upland habitat restoration areas. And we try to minimize those to the extent that they're done so that they are not too much for the existing staff there to chew off. So in this case, we have basically the long-term cost on the habitat restoration side of this is probably I'd say about half the time of the 4 full-time staff out there for the next 3 or 4 years, and then it starts to taper off because we've disturbed all the land out there, we've replanted it, but there's an establishment period that comes into that where it's really important to put a lot of effort on those first couple of years afterwards to make sure you get the desirable vegetation established so they can outcompete the constant seed source of undesirable vegetation that's going to go on to that. The really good thing with this too is there's a lot of areas that we're restoring this back to the original habitat that was out there, which was pine flatwoods. And we have staff that we do a lot of prescribed burning. We have we manage about 30,000 acres and we burn about 6,000 of that per year with the staff on site. We'll use fire as a management tool and it's incredibly cost effective. The other really valuable thing in terms of just kind of community outreach and using that in a coastal setting like this, where we're really lucky because we can put the smoke out over the water and not affect people. But it introduces the constant stream of new people moving to this area into the concept that fire is normal and natural and a necessary management tool so that you don't start to get vegetation overgrowth and have wildfires and those sorts of things. And then to the other point on, is there other opportunities like this? For one, Manatee County, I think in some respects, we were lucky just in the pattern of development regionally, whereas if you look at us compared to like Sarasota County or Pinellas County, those areas developed really quickly and got pretty dense. So north of us and south of us got dense. We still had a lot of agricultural areas that were towards the coast, like even into the 90s. Some people with vision saw those opportunities for these. The county was able to acquire some of those things. That's what, like the original map I saw, like we have a pretty nice amount of coastal property, especially when you include Terracea Preserve State Park in Manatee County that's under preservation. There's absolutely a ton of opportunities like this in South Hillsborough County. The other thing that, like thinking long-term about this, in my view, is that as we move on in the future and sea level rise continues to be a challenge, we're likely to have areas that become uninsurable, and it would be likely to, as they become uninsurable, a likely scenario there would be government buybacks of those areas. And then you have the question of what do you do with this coastal area that occasionally floods? To me, this is a very good example, and I've been asked by the Regional Planning Council to kind of present that as an example of a green infrastructure project where you can do something that adds community value in these coastal settings, creates a lot of habitat value, but this is that the blue carbon. This is that storage of carbon material in this coastal setting like this. So in terms of like fighting back against climate change, this is something that just by nature it ends up doing. The other thing that from a very pragmatic standpoint, if we're as a community looking at sea level rise issues into the future, is that this is a source of fill material to create things like this in that coastal setting. So if there's a line that's going to be drawn as to we're going to start berming this up or we're going to have to elevate our roads, currently the borrow pits and everything else, those are always way out east. If this starts happening this way, you have a source of fill material that by creating these coastal estuarine habitats that occasionally flood, you have trails and community values, but you also use the material to elevate and increase your resiliency. I think in a longer term sense, there's a lot of good opportunities for projects like this in that way too. And then, yeah, sorry, I just steamrolled everybody. That's what I do.
Part of the reason why we invited all his work, we know what he's doing for private right now, but we still anticipate working with him closely. Councilmember Greenfield's point, through the course of development of the 2020 Habitat Master Plan update, we did develop maps that have identified the existing opportunities in the watershed of the dark included, kind of hard to see here, the dark included, darker dense areas. There are still some areas where we have restoration potential and those opportunities are diminishing through time, but there are definitely similar projects along the coast in our documents that we can target in our targeting goals. We have developed those region partners and the map of specific region partner jurisdictions that we can share with those.
Are there any further questions or comments for Dane or three of our staff members?
I would just comment that we're very sorry to be losing Damon to the private sector in Manatee County, that he's a bank of knowledge, as you all have seen on this sort of thing, and truly dedicated to our county. And my district specifically is the coastal region, and he has a legacy that he's leaving behind in Western Manatee County, primarily from this signature project, but also a couple others as well. So we're very sad to see him go, but of course we wish him all the best.
You're gonna tear me up, Kevin.
Well, Damon, thank you so much. And it's clear that you've left a real impact and a real legacy. And
I'm just getting started, though.
we appreciate the presentation and wish you well in the private sector.
Yeah, one more information item for you. Dr. Mark, could I first then do an update on some of the Piney Point monitoring and the direct management that you all all of that part of what we're going to talk about. Give an overview of the results of the yes. Yeah,
I said last week when I gave this presentation at the management board meeting that I hated to follow Damon's presentation about all this great restoration work that's been going on. And now I'm going to talk about something completely different and opposite of that. So, you know, I think like many of us, Piney Point consumed a big part of our lives for the last 6 months. And so I want to speak to, I think, the collective knowledge and learning we got from that experience, and particularly my role at the Estuary program. You know, on the tech side, we were sort of in the trenches, compiling all of the data that was coming in from our partners, and a tremendous amount of effort that went into getting that information. And that, you know, informed a lot of understanding as this event progressed throughout the summer. But now I want to step back and sort of talk about how we're using that information to develop our scientific understanding of what happened this summer, and in particular how we're putting that out into the primary literature. So again, on the tech side, the Estuary program, I think it's our job to sort of not just guide the science, but be part of the science too, in terms of understanding of how the bay operates. And so we've kind of undergone a significant effort to put all of those data into a nice, I think, publishable unit that we're trying to get out there to the scientific literature, so that you know, we get that information out there and acknowledge the efforts of our partners to get those results. So I'll try to make this brief. I know it's been kind of a long meeting, but I just want to make sure that we all kind of understand what our motivation was for publishing this paper. So not just generally speaking, but what are the specific goals that we had for writing this up in a paper. I'm going to also go over some of the summary, a high-level summary of the events that we saw from essentially April to a month or two ago. So we had a lot of things happen throughout the bay, and it's sort of nice to think about them from this high-level perspective of, you know, what happened from A to B to C to D, and sort of develop that narrative of what happens when you put a bunch of inorganic nutrients into the bay, and how that manifests into changes that are not necessarily good for the health of the ecosystem. And then I'll talk about where we're going with the paper and what our next steps are. This is my old presentation. Anyway, so yeah, I wanted to start with this this table. This is actually the first table from the paper, just to again remind everybody why this event was so important in terms of what it could do towards the health of the bay and its water quality. So this is just showing you basically some measured water quality values from the actual stack where it was discharged in 2019, the end of pipe values at the discharge site at Port Manatee, and then sort of some long-term seasonal observations from the bay itself. Again, just to put it into perspective, what the water quality was like in the stack versus what we normally see in the bay. And so you see that, you know, there's measured concentrations for inorganic nitrogen, so nitrate, nitrite, ammonia. Ammonia in particular was the big one of concern because it's a huge limiting nutrient that we know can stimulate algae growth in the bay. So very, very high relative to a baseline value that we see in the bay proper. And so this was our concern, basically dumping a bunch of inorganic nutrients into the system, what that would mean for stimulating algae growth and what sort of cascading effects that would have for the system. This is another figure, again, putting it into perspective of what the bay normally receives in any given year in terms of nutrient loads. So this is showing you estimates for lower Tampa Bay, annual estimates going back from 1985 to last year. And then looking at kind of this recovery period that we're calling from 2006 to last year, when the bay was recovered, we had seagrass growth returns. Looking at the annual estimates for this time period of nutrient loads into the system, we see about on average 180 tons of nitrogen in the bay per year. And again, putting that into the perspective of what we saw with Piney Point, we estimated that there were about 205 tons discharged into the system of nitrogen over a 10-day period relative to what we normally receive in that lower part of the bay on an annual scale. So again, putting in perspective of how this event was a large influx of nutrients in the system beyond what we would normally see and what that means for potential impacts to the environment. So my goals for this paper, our goals for this paper really were a couple reasons. We know that we had a lot of effort. Everyone that was involved in this event, there's a tremendous amount of capital and resources going into getting the data. So we wanted to make sure that, once we had the data, it wasn't just one and done. We wanted to actually, again, get it out there in the primary literature as a means to kind of acknowledge all of the efforts towards that went to getting this information. So, as a scientist that's been publishing papers for a couple of years, it's common for me to have co-authors on papers, usually just like 4 or 5. Last count I had for this paper, we have 19 co-authors. So I thought it was really important to get a lot of representation from different institutions on the paper to show that this was a team effort to get this out there. And also, I think it's really important to create a record of this event. When I was writing the paper, I wanted to understand past events as well. This is not the first time we've had discharge from Piney Point, but I wanted to look at past events and sort of contrast that to what we had this year. And there's a handful of reports out there, kind of gray literature, a handful of papers in the scientific literature, but not a whole lot in terms of what has happened in the past. And so I think it's really important moving forward that we as a scientific community make sure that what was described this year is actually out there so that others can learn from this experience. So that was another primary reason I wanted to get it out there. As far as what the paper covers, I been sort of getting it by April to October, looking at these sort of initial impacts, describing the events of this summer, knowing that possibly there could be other long-term effects that are yet to be determined, but really just describing what we saw this year. So I'm describing that and sort of saying that, continued vigilance moving forward to make sure that the impacts we have moving forward, or potential impacts moving forward, can be contextualized based on what we saw this summer. And we were really careful talking about, linking what we saw in the bay to what was discharged from Piney Point, not necessarily saying there's an explicit cause and effect between what we saw with the discharge, because we know it's often kind of difficult to create a 100% absolute certain linkage between things, especially when we talk about like red tide, for example. So we're really presenting these events in terms of like a weight of evidence approach of really describing that there are actually several things we saw this year that are not normally seen in the bay during the summer, and really describing that as, this is a likely scenario as Piney Point contributing to these factors, but not necessarily really saying that things are actually caused. So being very careful with the description there. How we framed the analysis really was focusing on the conventional management paradigm we use for the bay. So knowing essentially that nitrogen loads can stimulate algae growth in the water column that can lead to potential water quality conditions that are unfavorable for seagrass growth. So that's been the recovery and success story for the bay. Through reducing nitrogen loads, we saw a recovery in seagrasses. So that was our concern with Piney Point, essentially, is that nutrients entering the system could create conditions that are unfavorable for seagrass growth. So we're looking at seagrass as an endpoint of potential impacts in the bay, but also looking at sort of the chain of events of other factors leading to a potential change in seagrass. This is a narrative or sort of a timeline of the events of what happened this summer. So this is a graphic that Joe put together, but really just kind of laying out the series of events from April to basically now. And so I think we're all familiar with what happened, but just to kind of remind you all, again, we saw a series of events that were not necessarily normally observed in the bay in any given summer. So first we had essentially a sort of localized response right around Piney Point. In April, we saw a diatom bloom, which is your sort of run-of-the-mill phytoplankton species we see in the bay. This was kind of expected, right near the discharge site. We're sort of anticipating that initial phytoplankton response. That sort of dissipated fairly quickly, so by May it wasn't necessarily observed. But around the same time, we started seeing increased observations of what we're calling floating cyanobacteria mats, so Lingbia, which is like a filamentous floating macroalgal species that we do see in the bay, but it tended to pop up in places where anecdotally people hadn't seen those high abundances. So Anna Maria Sound, Port Manatee, we saw it also in our seagrass transects. That was sort of the second event that, we were like, hey, something's not normal here. The third thing was, of course, the red tide that we saw in the bay this year. So we know the red tide is kind of a naturally occurring thing out in the Gulf of Mexico. But again, in the bay this year, at the concentrations that we were seeing, the cell counts for red tide was definitely not a regularly occurring event in the bay. And of course, that led to lots of fish kills, a lot of efforts to clean those up, and just a tremendous amount of resources being spent towards cleanup efforts there. And then by July, after the red tide sort of subsided, actually conditions were fairly stable around August and October. So those are my sort of the four events that we're talking about. We'll talk about kind of the weight of evidence in terms of abnormal things that we normally don't see happening in the bay. Localized phytoplankton response right around Piney Point at the beginning, the cyanobacteria mats, the red tide, and the fish kills. So those are the four main things that we saw. And this is kind of the narrative we're developing for the paper, but we wanted to obviously back this up with the quantitative data that we had collected throughout the summer to really tell that story in a true scientific fashion. So just to remind everybody, we had dozens of partners out there collecting this information. And so this is kind of a map showing those sample locations. On the left here, you see, these are kind of areas of interest. We divided up the bay in terms of where we thought these responses could be manifested, the discharge. So this was also driven by simulation modeling from USF, where they sort of tracked theoretical plume dispersal around Piney Point. We sort of developed our monitoring and tracked our responses relative to that. These white dots are actually where the long-term monitoring stations are from Hillsborough County and Madison County. This becomes really important when we talk about contextualizing the results from this year in terms of what's normal or what's not. But all these points here represents thousands of sample points where we have partners going out and getting information on water quality, phytoplankton, seagrass, macroalgae, contaminants, a couple other things. But just tremendous amount of effort. I think last count I had for water quality was like 11,000 samples collected since April. So huge amount of time and effort going into getting this data. And so, we sort of served as a repository for that information. We said, give us the data, we'll synthesize it, report back to you on what we see happening in real time through our dashboard, and then finally in this paper here. And so just to sort of step back again and look at these changes from the data, going back to that narrative I was telling you about, this is sort of putting it in the context of our nutrient management paradigm. So looking at total nitrogen as sort of the stimulatory water quality constituent that could drive a lot of these changes, these cascading effects, how that might manifest chlorophyll changes with phytoplankton blooms, and then finally Secchi observations, which is a measure of water clarity in the water column that can have a direct indication of the quality of the habitat for seagrass growth. So all this is really showing you basically is that these red points, the points that are outlined in black, are observations that are outside of the normal range for the bay in the time of year that we're looking at here. And what we mean by normal range is, again, going back to the historical monitoring data we have from Hillsborough County and Manatee County, looking at what a normal value is for any one of these things in any given month, looking at a normal range of those and contextualizing the water quality values we saw this year in terms of what's above that normal range or what's below that normal range. And take home here is that you see that there's a lot of observations that are not within the expectation for the bay in this time of year. So that, of course, was a big concern and not entirely expected based on what we anticipated. This is a timeline of events too. So just looking at, again, from the end of March to basically a month or so ago, looking at total nitrogen, chlorophyll, and Secchi depth, following that nutrient management paradigm. This shows you the progression of observations for that area right around Pine Point that is, again, following that narrative that we developed around the abnormal responses we're seeing in the bay. So these blue bars here are those normal monthly ranges we estimated from the long-term monitoring data sets. So, we were expecting, had Piney Point not happened this year, values would be within those ranges. But as you see from these plots, a lot of these values are above the normal ranges. So nitrogen, that's no surprise. Chlorophyll, that would be stimulated from the nitrogen influxes. And then Secchi values, we saw water transparency or water clarity being lower than normal for this part of the bay in this time of year. Also wanted to point out too that the chlorophyll observations here, this is an indication of algae growth in the bay, and there's a very clear signal of these diatom blooms I talked about in April. So this peak here, this is right around Piney Point. These are basically the diatoms growing as the immediate response to the discharge from Piney Point. And then later in July, you see these spikes with chlorophyll that corresponds to the red tide event. So again, that was another indication that the water quality was reflecting those changes that we were describing. Skip that one. A big question we had was, again, what was the impact of seagrass resources? That's kind of our bread and butter as a program in terms of our endpoint for monitoring. And the short answer is we really didn't see a lot of changes in seagrass, and that could be for a few reasons. Within the time frame we're looking at, it very could well be that seagrasses don't respond that quickly within a 5 to 6 month period. So obviously we're continue monitoring in the future to make sure we don't see any long-term effects of changes in water quality and what that means for seagrasses. What we did see though is macroalgae changes, so seaweed, if you will. That was obviously a lot more dynamic over time than the seagrasses because those tend to uptake nutrients a lot quicker and respond in sort of more ephemeral modes of time than seagrasses. But we saw a lot of variation. This is basically just showing the frequency and occurrence of macroalgae and seagrass over time. And so there's a lot going on with the macroalgae. These blue dots are the spike and the cyanobacteria mats I was talking about. So we were keeping a close eye on macroalgae, knowing that this could be another indication of a response to the nutrient influx in Pine Point. The only downfall with looking at the macroalgae and seagrasses is we don't necessarily have a long-term record of seasonal data for these species like we do have for water quality. We do have long-term annual data going back every year. We have transect surveys every 2 years. We have aerial coverage maps, but we don't have a high-resolution seasonal data set at the level of individual species like we were collecting in April or this year. So we weren't necessarily able to say that these changes were abnormal or just a natural seasonal variation over time. So that's kind of a knowledge gap we have for this data set. And then, red tide obviously was the other abnormal event we saw this year. So again, just putting 2021 into perspective, you see this is a long-term record going back to 1953. So 2021 stands out, but there are other years where we do see high red tide in the bay. So this isn't the first time it's happened, but it is an uncommon experience. And if you put this in context of other abnormal things we saw after this year, you can sort of connect the dots and sort of develop a narrative about how this was potentially stimulated by Pine Point. And this is just showing the summer months for 2021 and how the fish kill reports actually tracked the red tide concentrations almost 1-to-1, which is, I think as a scientist, fascinating. You see that in the data set following an expectation. The other thing we were really careful about too with red tide is that there were some other factors to consider when interpreting these trends. So we know that, for example, leading up to the growing season this year in the summer, we had lower than normal rainfall, which actually elevated the salinity values in the bay, actually creating conditions that were more favorable for red tide. Again, Perennia brevis, the species of red tide, the organism of red tide, originates in the Gulf, so very hypersaline environment. With low rainfall this year, the bay was actually more like the Gulf, so it actually created conditions more favorable for the growth of Perennia brevis. Weather patterns as well. We had a storm come through that actually turned up the water column through high winds, moved around a lot of dead fish. And so when we're talking about understanding was red tide exacerbated by Piney Point, probably, but we also have to think about salinity conditions, other weather events in terms of describing what could have exacerbated the changes as well this year. Yeah, I'm gonna skip that one. So really, to wrap it all up, talked about kind of the weight of evidence, the data supporting that, but I think if we were to just talk generally about Piney Point, what we saw this year, I don't think anybody would really dispute the fact that the bay did take a hit from this event. The series of events that we saw in 2021, I think as a scientist can be plausibly linked to this large initial inorganic nutrient source coming from Piney Point. But when we talk about, the trends, we have to think about other factors, what was the weather like this year? What other events happened that maybe are useful to think about when we describe what is a true sort of cause and effect? That's just something to be careful about as an objective description of the events. As far as seagrasses go, at least this year, it looked like the resources that we monitored appear to be okay. No initial effects of Piney Point, but we do need to be sure that obviously we continue monitoring next year as we're doing. We're finishing up transect surveys this year from our normal annual monitoring, and we'll make sure that we check to verify that there really have been no long-term impacts of Piney Point on the seagrass resources. Another take home is that the events we saw this year, there are a lot of strange things that happened, but they were actually fairly short-lived, so kind of ephemeral things, which is good news. Even though they were short-lived, the impacts were obviously very expensive, so I'm not sort of discounting the cost of, say, fish kill cleanup efforts. But I think it's in describing the health of the bay, these short-term impacts are generally good. They're not persisting for a while, which would not be a good thing. Obviously, the long-term impacts remain uncertain. As I keep saying, we'll continue to monitor and make sure that these events didn't have any long-term impacts. But I also, to keep these things in mind, I like to emphasize that, why did we see such a short-term sort of ephemeral impact of this event? I think that as a program, we've done a lot over the years to really make sure that the bay is recovered. Without these kind of past successes to create such a resilient system that is generally overall healthy, I don't think the events we saw this year would have been so short-lived. So because we've sort of invested in the health of the bay over time, I think it can kind of, absorb these kind of acute impacts of, say, a large nutrient influx at Piney Point. However, I think moving forward, we need to be very careful because we do have, challenges. Some parts of the bay need some targeted management actions to make sure they get back on track, like Old Tampa Bay, for example. But we need to be careful that, we don't just rest on our past successes and be aware that we do have stressors now that might create a system that is not so resilient in the future to these acute impacts that, if they were to happen again, it might actually push the bay into a state that is, actually not in a condition that we have it today. So that's just kind of, I think, something to think about in a broad picture. If you didn't see, if you go to these slides, this link right here goes to a nice op-ed that Lindsay Cross wrote that was published in Tampa Bay Times. Kind of sort of relates this event in 2021 to kind of like this metaphor about like the health of an individual. So it's kind of like the bay had a heart attack, right? So Piney Point is kind of like a heart attack. because the bay is so healthy, you know, any healthy individual, if you have a heart attack, you're probably going to recover. But if you're really unhealthy, that heart attack might push you over the edge. So again, going back to what I was saying about just the resilience of the system, I think we're fortunate to have a generally healthy bay, but it might not be that way in the future. And these short-term events could push it over into kind of an undesirable state that it wouldn't be good for not just the wildlife, the environment, but us living in the system as well. So yeah, that's pretty much the high-level overview of what we're trying to do with this paper. Just to give you guys a timeline about what our next steps are. Paper's pretty much done. I actually returned it back to co-authors yesterday for final review before we submit it to, we're actually targeting a journal called Marine Pollution Bulletin, which I think is a good venue for this. And also, you know, when it does get submitted to the journal, we are planning on publishing a preprint, which is something that can be distributed, knowing that it's not going to be, you know, fully peer reviewed at that point, but it is something that you know, we can say, you know, this is a summary that we can talk about now. Also, the data sets that go into this, you know, as a data scientist, I often spend a large part of my time trying to find old data sets, and that was certainly the case for understanding or trying to describe the past events and Pine Point. But moving forward with this event, I want to make sure that all of the data that was collected by our partners is actually put online in a repository where others can find it, access it, download it, and hopefully by doing so, we can kind of build the science and move forward in a much more better way than I think it's been done in the past. So yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Just also want to remind folks that the dashboard that we developed for this is still very much online and running. I keep putting up data as we get it. It's not coming as frequently now, thankfully, but it is still there as a resource. And if you want to have a look at the draft manuscript, you can go here or just send me an email. I'll be happy to share it. So yeah, thank you.
Any questions or comments, Mark?
Are your arms tired at the end of your presentations? I mean, you keep our attention, and I like it, but you did a great job with this. You did a great job with this, though. Thank you.
I know that the publication is going to be very scientific in nature, but nevertheless, I would like to see that distributed more. Thank you very much. Job well done. Send our things to all the co-authors.
Yeah, it's a team effort. I feel lucky to be able to like be first author on this paper, but again, there's so many people that are part of this effort that I think are really important to not just maybe the co-authors, but the list of acknowledgements in the paper is very long. So
thank you so much.
Yep.
Only other remaining item is board packet information. At the tail end of the packet is what we did for the update of all that program activity. Link to an online portal that you drill down specific products via question. Other than that, I just want to also highlight that upcoming board meetings are also highlighted in the packet as well. Next policy board meeting is February 18th, 2022 year. With that, the majority of the
Any questions or comments? Pretty good Well, with that, I wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving and to the staff. I hope you've got time and opportunity to spend time with family and relax and unwind. And given that we won't be together again until February, I wish everyone a happy holiday season and a happy New Year. With that, this meeting is adjourned.
No, it's not. I'm good.